The delightful Ed Wynn traveled back to the Twilight Zone for the first time since 1959's One for the Angels. In 90 Years Without Slumbering, Wynn plays another charming older man pondering the end of his days. There's a decent amount of information behind this one, including all the changes to the original version of the script, so let's get into it. Sam Forstmann is a 76-year-old grandfather who lives with his pregnant granddaughter Marnie and her husband Doug. The old man has a very special connection to the grandfather clock he keeps in his room. It was purchased on the day of his birth, and his father and grandfather always told him that when the clock stops, Sam will die. For his entire life, Forstmann has maintained the large timepiece, but recently, it's been malfunctioning. He wakes up in the middle of the night just to wind it, and this behavior has been disturbing Marnie and Doug. They worry about him enough to send him to a psychiatrist, where Sam recounts the outlandish story his forebears always told him. He eventually agrees to give the clock to Marnie's friend Carol in exchange for being able to stop by every other day to wind it. But when Carol and her husband go out of town for the weekend, Sam isn't able to tend to his family heirloom. That night, he can feel the clock slowing down, and his life might be slowing down with it. One-time Zone director Roger Kay, director of photography Robert Pittick, and editor Richard Heermans brought some much-needed energy to the visuals and pacing. Interesting angles, camera movements, overlays, match dissolves, and a solid stride from scene to scene created an engaging story for 90 Years Without Slumbering. There aren't any otherworldly locations or set pieces, but it was the simple things, like dissolving from a clock in the psychiatrist's office to the grandfather clock, that added up to some great work and encompassed the themes of the story. They even threw in a crew member during Rod's whip pan. Ed Wynn is probably the biggest reason why I liked this episode as much as I did. He's such a charismatic, genuine, warm, and humorous presence on screen. It was the same appeal he had in One for the Angels, except it's in a less fantastical piece of fiction that highlights a few different shades of his acting ability, including the character's palpable desperation to stay alive.
Please don't stop. I'll never forget to wind you again. I promise. With a clock as old as that, you're bound to run into problems, you know. Just like old people.
The rest of the cast does well, with Carolyn Kearney as Marnie bouncing off Wynn the most. She wasn't in any other official Twilight Zone episode, but did appear in Rod Serling's test run for the show called The Time Element. Mentioned in a previous review, that was a 1958 episode of Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse. Dick Wilson and Chuck Hicks as the Clock Movers and William Sargent as Dr. Mel Avery each popped up in one other episode. I really enjoyed Sargent's scene with Wynn in the psychiatrist's office. The pair's playful back and forth was fun to watch, and punctuated by Sam admitting his strange obsession at the very end.
We're not talking about my clock, we're talking about your clock.
So you have a grandfather's clock too, Doctor, huh?
Mr. Forstmann, we were talking about you.
Oh, I could talk about clocks for hours, Doctor. But your time's expensive. Mine's free. When my clock stops ticking, I'll die.
If I had a clock like that, I'd get rid of it.
Bernard Herrmann composed his final original Twilight Zone score for 90 Years Without Slumbering. I've heavily praised his contributions to the show over the years, and this soundtrack is no exception. The music very cleverly weaves in the melody of Henry Clay Work's 1876 song, My Grandfather's Clock. Sam also sings it at the top of the installment.
90 years without slumbering. Tick-tock, tick-tock, oh.
I'm not sure how many people out there remember this song from their youth, but I had a music teacher in grade school who would play this for us on a regular basis. It was a personal favorite, so thanks for that, Mr. Selly. If you look at the writing credits for this episode, you'll see two names. Richard D. Roy is given his due for the teleplay, based on a story by Johnson Smith. This was the only TZF D. Roy worked on, but he does have lots of other projects to his name across a 4-decade career. Johnson Smith is actually a pseudonym for George Clayton Johnson. Good old GCJ wrote some of the most memorable scripts of the show's entire run, including A Game of Pool and Kick the Can. He hadn't written an episode that aired since the latter in 1962, but it wasn't for a lack of trying. At one point, Johnson penned a script called Sea Change about a man who loses his hand but later discovers it's growing back. The wrinkle is, the hand is somehow part of another man who's infiltrating the original's body, and they fight for control. After it was initially purchased, the main sponsor of Twilight Zone at the time wasn't comfortable with the premise, and George decided to buy his script back. Eventually, Sea Change was adapted into a comic book story in the second issue of Deepest Dimension Terror Anthology. There are some conflicting stories on how the tale that ultimately became 90 Years Without Slumbering came about. We know for sure that Johnson came up with a concept called the grandfather clock, inspired by the Henry Clay Works song. He was given the go-ahead to produce a full teleplay, and the finished script ended up being titled Tick of Time. The teleplay was shelved for a while due to producer changes until William Frug hired Richard D. Roy to rewrite it. Johnson was not a fan of his reworked idea and made sure he was only credited under a pseudonym when the episode aired. While the setup is basically the same, the ending is quite different. In a panic, Sam walks over to Carol's empty house and smashes a window, trying to get inside and wind the clock. A police car drives by at the same time, with an officer apprehending the old man and sending him back home. Forstmann resigns to his fate and takes what he believes to be his final sleep. The clock stops and Sam's spirit leaves his body. However, he wakes up and interacts with it. Sam no longer believes his fate is tied to the timepiece. After all,
I've been to a psychiatrist.
the spirit fades, and Sam goes back to sleep with a newfound confidence. Sometime later, Marnie checks in on her grandfather. He admits to her that when the clock died, he was reborn.
Clocks are made by men. God creates time. No man can prolong his allotted hours. He can only live them to the fullest, in this world or in the Twilight Zone.
Mark Scott Zickrey outlined Johnson's original Tick of Time story in the Twilight Zone Companion. Instead of giving it to a neighbor, the main character hands over the clock to an antique dealer. Like in the episode, he changes his mind and tries to retrieve it, but with the help of a young boy and a child's wagon. Quote, "It is an exhausting and hazardous ordeal, made doubly so by the knowledge that a grandfather clock, in order to keep ticking, must remain absolutely upright. When the old man tries to lift the clock out of the wagon, it falls on top of him. It stops ticking, and he dies. Several bystanders set the clock upright. At the same moment that it begins to tick again, the man's granddaughter gives birth to her baby. The cycle begins anew." Unquote. While overall I do like 90 Years Without Slumbering, the ending always felt weird. We don't really get a payoff. Sam talking to his own spirit, while humorous,
You are 76. Don't give me that spirit of 76 stuff.
seems a bit too goofy for where the story was naturally heading. When I read George Clayton Johnson's original ending, it just made perfect sense. That's substantially more in line with the narrative and fits the mold of the series much better. I wish we at least had a version of that finish instead. Johnson would address the specific change of Sam no longer buying into his connection with the clock as thus, quote, "It makes the plot trivial. If you're going to get involved in his problems, you've got to believe his problems. And if he doesn't believe them, you feel cheated." Unquote. I'm sure GCJ's script would have made for a more satisfying installment, but again, 90 Years Without Slumbering still works because of the overall production techniques and Ed Wynn's diverse performance. The ending's not great, but this one still built up enough benevolence to make a positive impression. It gets my recommendation. Check it out and tell me what you think. It's another story that reminds us time may tick very differently in the Twilight Zone.